Well, good evening, and I want to thank all of you for coming. My name is Dede. I teach on the faculty here. I'm delighted to be able to introduce our Askwith speaker tonight and to serve as discussant for her. I want to thank Diana Oblinger for bringing the warm weather with her. It may seem ironic to describe weather above 40 degrees as warm, but actually feels pretty good to me. So, Diana is president and CEO of EDUCAUSE, which is a nonprofit organization that advances higher education through the use of information technology. It's essentially a professional association for CTOs and CIOs, but there are a lot of high-level educational leaders and faculty who participate in the things that they do. And there are over 2,400 colleges, universities, and education organizations as members, including now a substantial international presence, so not just domestic. Previously, though, Diana wore the shoes that we wear, so she was very involved in academia and business. She was vice president for information resources and the chief information officer for the University of North Carolina system. She was executive director of higher education for Microsoft, and she was at IBM the director of the Institute for Academic Technology. And this kind of an alternation between business and higher education is really a very powerful preparation. She founded the EDUCAUSE Learning Initiative and is somebody who's participated in those events which center around teaching, learning, and technology. I can tell you that they're terrific. And in collaboration with the Gates Foundation, she led the creation of the Next Generation Learning Challenges, which is a $65 million program focused on improving college readiness and completion through information technologies, looking at new models for higher education that can help to reach new populations that are historically underserved. Jim Honan and I, and probably others from Harvard, have participated in helping with that initiative. I'll just say on a personal level that I've known Diana for probably longer than either she or I wants to admit, and that she's fabulous. And 2 years ago, the National Science Foundation asked me to co-convene a workshop on MOOCs and massive learning with Eric Grimson, who is the chancellor at MIT. And they said invite about 15 people, and the first person I picked up the phone and called was Diana. So you have a real privilege tonight. Diana, please.
Thank you very much. And I will get a little audio here. Can you hear all right? There we are. Good. Don't start too quickly. So what I'd like to do is actually give you a broad brush picture of a lot of things that are part of the education environment, some things about cognitive science, some things about consumers, and try to piece it all together and give you an idea of where things might be going in the future. So you'll see the term on the opening that talks about the digital ecosystem. So it's not just one future for higher education. What I really want you to think about is multiple integrated systems that flex and move as we go along. So if I can get the first slide, then we will jump right in here. So, the digital ecosystem and higher education's futures. So, good. Where I'd like to start, taking a look at the world around us. Now, there are lots of things that you could think about in terms of the world around us, but I want to just share with you 3 things very quickly to sort of set the stage. One of those is to ask you to reflect on how our expectations and experiences are fundamentally different now because of technology. You can't go anywhere that someone doesn't have a mobile device. Google Glasses may be out, but other things are coming in. Apple Watches, and we now experience the world through technology, with technology, and expect fundamentally different things as a result of it, whether it's in our personal lives, whether it's in education, whether it's in the consumer business. So that's the first point, is that our expectations and experiences are different. The second one, I would ask you to remember every time you are tempted to do an either or, it's either good or it's bad, or it's face-to-face or online, is remind yourself that in this kind of world, it's really about technology and human capability being combinatorial. They don't have to be separate. They don't have to be in opposition. That increasingly the world that we're seeing is how they come together and how they actually combine. And the third I would ask you to think about is the demographics of education, the demographics of lifelong learning, the demographics of the world that we are now part of. And as you know, economic well-being is one of the things that's very important to everyone in the world, and more people need education rather than fewer. Yet many people are trying to get education when they are in the workplace full-time. So when you think about these futures of higher education in the ecosystem, remember there may be an ecosystem that looks very much like Harvard, residential, very intense environment. There may be another ecosystem that's developing that is very much about adult learners who are looking for a different kind of pattern, one where you might say convenience is paramount because it's only one of many things that they do, that it's about completion and getting a credential so that they can move up the workforce. It's about how affordable the degree is, and it's about the credential. So take those as 3 data points in the world around us. Now what I'd like to do is give you 3 different slices of what that world might look like. And again, please don't think of them as one as opposed to the other, but how they are emerging and evolving. So one of those experiences I want you to think about is actually the learner experience. I want to talk about pathways to attainment. And then I want to talk about some novel models that we're seeing because technology does allow us to do things differently. And my premise is that this convergence of technology, learning science, and consumer demand is really going to create a new environment. And when we finish, Chris and I will come back and talk about what that new education revolution might look like. And of course, the Graduate School of Education is right on the forefront of creating that. So first, learning experiences. Experiences really matter, don't they? It's not just what you do, but it's that overall experience. And if you were going to look for a place to apply technology, a place to do things differently, you might want to look for ways to improve engagement. So the kinds of things that your students, you think about as high points of your education were those engagement, intense engagement with people, with the institution, with alumni. There are low points. Maybe we can do some things better with those low points, and there's some places that are rocky. And so the question I would like to ask you in this particular segment is there a way that the digital, however you want to define that, can strengthen both engagement and enhance the student experience? Not replace face-to-face, but engage and enhance. So let me give you some examples of how we're beginning to see that manifesting, and maybe you all will create the next set of enhancing and engaging experiences. And the first way I would think about it is to think about how we can do things differently that are both experiential and immersive, because really what we're after is ways of deepening learning. And I'll give you an example of how technology is allowing us to do that. This happens to be a relatively new application called Z-Space. And if you were studying anatomy, you could do it in a book that's 2-dimensional, and you could look at the images. Or you could have this immersive experience where you see it in 3 dimensions. Which one do you think is the more engaging learning experience? Which one do you think is going to help you more in how you move through your profession? So tools like this that allow us to go from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions clearly do not replace the face-to-face experience, they can enhance it. And so when you think also about interfaces and you think about technology, please do not think about a monitor and a keyboard. Think about interfaces like this, because that's how you change the experiences, right? So one way to think about experiencing learning. I think another really important point about learning is that higher order learning comes from really complicated challenges. Now, I'm going to give you some background information, but I'm not really challenging you at this point, am I? But imagine if we went into a simulation or a game-like environment. This is actually one of the new sim games. It's about sort of a sim city, and it is really an experiential learning space. It's multiple people, it's multiple disciplines, all kinds of things happening simultaneously. Since it is digital, you leave data behind, you can track things and come back to those later. But it situates learning in a very complex environment. So what you start out with in the classroom, in what you read, in what you talk about, becomes situated in this complex environment. You interact with other people, and that really deepens learning. So as part of this future digital ecosystem, I would expect actually that you will see more and more of these gaming environments that are probably more accurately termed experiential learning spaces, because they do situate you in a very immersive, engaging kind of experience. Another key point about experiences in learning is that practice helps people develop expertise. You don't want to come out of college as a novice learner. You want to develop expertise. And that means you have to do things over and over again so it becomes second nature, and so you develop self-confidence. And again, technology provides us with a set of tools that can help create expertise in maybe a different way. This happens to be a shot of a simulation developed at the University of Southern California that is run by artificial intelligence. Obviously, it's a clinical type of simulation. And what many times we think about is that experience going out to the learner. And it's great because you can change that every single time. Every learner can have a different experience. Every time someone tries it, they might learn something different. But don't forget the flip side of that digital experience. Just as information is going out, information's coming back, because even web cameras can almost measure somebody's heartbeat. There's advanced forms of telemetry that allows people to collect information, understand your response, understand your stress level. Your identity is revealed in how you type on a keyboard, the pressure, the speed. So again, when you think about these deeper learning environments, it's not just what you're pushing towards the learner. It's what you're gaining back from the learner that can be very, very powerful. And of course, it's not just about learning environments, it's about learning to do things. And it wouldn't be complete for us to talk about learning experiences without talking about research and a scholarly experience. So let me give you an example of just one of many, many ways that students learn by being scholars. And I'll pick this from the humanities. It happens to be a medieval poem. Many of you probably know about this, know much more about it, I'm sure, than I do, called Roman de la Rose. And these are illustrated manuscripts that are literally sprinkled all over the world. And of course, the way they used to have to be studied is by people spending their entire career going from place to place to place, waiting in line to study these manuscripts. Well, now, of course, it's online, it's digitized. Not only do you not have to spend your career traveling and waiting to see the manuscripts, but you have unique tools that allow you to study it, to overlay a variety of information. And, oh, by the way, our students actually participate in creating many of these archives. So they learn not just by studying them, but by creating the scholarship that goes around them. So again, when you think about the learning experience, is there an element of the digital that can enhance what we do today? And the final point I will make about the learning experience is, again, to think about another piece of learning. So it's not just about what you learn. You need feedback. there needs to be assessment. And we have, again, a very rich set of tools today to begin exploring that in ways that we simply have never been able to do before. So here's an example of an application that was developed at the University of Central Florida. It's being used on campuses around the country right now, and it's a mixed reality environment. So the student can be in a live classroom. There are avatars that the student sees that are being run actually by experts in the background. And it collects a lot of assessment information. And people are now looking at these mixed reality environments, not just for educating students and giving them practice, but for assessing their proficiency and guiding them for where to go next. And increasingly, people are looking at these kinds of assessment environments for certification and recertification. So you might be able to think about changing the environment using the digital learning experience. Can you use the digital? The second place that I'd like to think about is an area that I'll call pathways to graduation, pathways to attainment. A lot of students come into higher education and they don't finish. And one of the big problems, probably the number one problem that people talk about in higher education is the cost of higher education, right? And so there are many ways that you could talk about trying to attack that problem of cost. Many times people say, well, technology, you can certainly use technology. But maybe a more nuanced approach to that is to say one of the best ways to reduce the overall cost of education is to reduce the delays in people being able to graduate. And there's some figures cited up there for what happens, both in terms of raw cost and opportunity cost for a delay in graduation if you are in a community college or in a four-year program. And that's pretty substantial. And for some people that might not make a difference, but if you are financially constrained in the first place, that kind of cost may actually be more than an individual can bear. So realizing that there's a wonderful educational experience, for some people, it's constrained by factors that are beyond their control, such as cost and time. And a question that I think is important to ask is there a way to reduce cost without reducing learning? We're not about low quality, but can you manipulate some variables to ultimately get to our goal, which is people attaining the goals that they've got? So one way you may be able to approach that using technology is with analytics. And analytics is this whole thing about using massive amounts of data, looking for patterns, and then doing things in terms of prediction, remediation that you might not be able to do before. And as we do more things online, we have more data available, we can begin to do more things. This is an example of adaptive learning, and you're seeing adaptive learning being used fairly commonly now by large publishers, and many colleges and universities are doing this. And the whole point is that people learn at different rates, in different patterns, and if you have enough data, like millions of observations, you can begin to see patterns. And very quickly, I can identify my pattern compared to your pattern compared to someone else's. And I can begin to path you through that in a way that is more optimal for you. Because there's nothing less personal about education than having one size fits all. And these tools begin to allow people to personalize their education. The figures are pretty interesting. In many of the initial studies, it reduces time to mastery. There's a statistics course that is many times cited where students are able to reach mastery in 25% less time. There's increasing use of adaptive learning in particularly remedial areas where you can improve student attainment and move them through much more quickly. So think about maybe adaptive learning is a way to better use people's time so they achieve mastery sooner, allowing you to achieve more. Another point is maybe there's a whole different structure that we ought to be thinking about that allows you to reduce time and shift where the cost is. And think about the way that our education is designed right now. Much of it is predicated on an assumption of seat time and the credit hour. So there's something that is really catching fire right now called competency-based education. It is not new, but it is moving much more rapidly because now we have many of the technology tools. We have more behind the learning science, and we have a very different demographic and consumption pattern that's making people find this very interesting. And what you see with competency-based education is that rather than defining the process, you define the outcomes and what people need to achieve. And it's a very interesting process. It's highly individualized because to get someone to that end point, you have to individualize what's happening. You provide constant feedback, formative feedback about you're closer, you're farther, you're 2 steps ahead, you're now 5 steps ahead, so that people see that constant progress. And it's motivating to a lot of people because they can see their progression. They see the achievement. It's no longer a black box. And with CBE, one of the really interesting things for adult learners in particular is it doesn't matter where you learned it. You could have read a book, you could have experienced something in the military, it could have been part of your job, but it might all apply to where you're trying to go. So is there a way to understand what people know how to do without taking them through the entire path? And CBE may be one of those things. Another point is that a lot of our students slow down, stop out, and drop out because they experience failure. Failure on a test, failure in a course, and a lot of times they don't know what's coming. Some of you have heard me tell this story. I thought I was going to be a chemist early in my college career, and I hit organic chemistry, and that stopped things dead on. And I screwed up the first test, and it completely changed things. I wasn't studying enough, and I didn't know it. I was a freshman. I really had no clue what was going on. And there are a lot of students who have similar kinds of experiences where they run into a problem that they didn't know was coming. So you're seeing the emergence of what some people call intrusive advising, which looks at the data and predictions of, are you spending enough time online? Have you shown up for class? Are you doing these assignments? Do you have a certain kind of risk profile? And it's not cause-effect, it's predictive. So it says, you know, this guy is likely to have a problem, so we're going to pay attention to how often he shows up. And if he's missing from class a certain number of days or online performance, we're going to reach out and say, you know, you might have a problem, or you need to change this pattern. And it's not just about babysitting students. It is truly about reminding people that their behavior may not align with what they want to achieve. And the good news with intrusive advising is that for many learners, they develop metacognitive skills and learn how they need to adjust their behavior so that in the future they don't have the same problems. So maybe there's a way of shortcutting failure for students in ways that we didn't used to have. So not everybody will change majors out of chemistry like I did all those many years ago. And another important point is that for a lot of our students, an increasing percentage of students in American higher education, they don't necessarily know where they're going or exactly how to get there. If you present people with too many options, they can get lost. Again, personal experience, maybe you've had something similar. Present me with a course catalog, I can find millions of things that I want to take, but it may not lead me on a pathway to graduation. And it doesn't mean I might not want to explore, but I might want to know if I've just chosen a set of courses that takes me from a 4-year degree program to a 5-year degree program and says, is that what you wanted to do? So we're seeing an increasing number of tools that are about guiding students on pathways to graduation. Doesn't mean it takes away options. It helps you see the road in front of you and make informed choices. This happens to be a tool from Georgia State University that is called GPS. They named it after exactly what they intend it to do. And it uses predictive analytics, like I mentioned before, and progressive advising to help guide people on pathways so they know what they need to take, when they need to take it, and what is going to come next. And if you look at some of the results, it's pretty promising, isn't it? Because for many state-based institutions, the support for higher education is certainly not increasing. For the students, they have financial constraints. And the results on many of these early GPS-like systems are that it is saving the institution money, and it's saving the individual's money, and it's retaining students at greater rates. So does that help you on a pathway to attainment? And if it's a pathway rather than the quality of your education, is that something that might be interesting? So a second way that you might think about using technology. Now I want to shift and do something a little bit different, because one of the things that's very interesting if you think about the overall environment with technology is you've got radically different models that are upsetting a lot of our assumptions. So think about Amazon. We thought it was kind of silly to start with. Now they're taking over all kinds of businesses, delivering packages. They are actually running the postal service in many different ways. They had a different set of assumptions about what they were doing and how they were going to use it. And technology is very much embedded in many of those models. And when you use technology, many times you can uncouple and recouple things in very different ways. And so what you see now is an environment where we've got a whole set of different tools that are emerging. That's sort of a hype cycle, adoption cycle, where you've got different business models, research, analytics. And what if you began to mix and match those things in different ways to approach a different set of problems? And so the question that I'd like you to ask in this segment is, can you invent some alternative models if you use different delivery systems, if you use different support models, and if you have different business models? And this is where I think many of your students are going to absolutely excel, because they are working on some of these problems. So here's an example I want to give you that actually came from some students in Chris's class on Monday. And it really is an example of how the curriculum can be recentered using a very different model in something that is quite a decentralized institution. And your students went and actually visited Minerva. Minerva is a startup organization. They just entered their first students this fall, and it is designed to be an alternative to an Ivy League institution. It's all about liberal arts education. They have really recentered on fundamental competencies. They're very much focused on the global, but they don't have a lot of the same appendages, if you will, that traditional institutions do. They don't have a campus. They've got students in a residential setting in San Francisco. They're going to open 7 or 9 different locations here in the next year, so students will be able to actually live in different places. They do their learning online with a platform that was designed by Minerva with the best of cognitive science behind it. It's very active. I think the students actually found it a delightful platform to think about learning with. Not at all lecture, not all video, lots of individual groups bringing people back together again. But rather than having the campus experience, the students are buying into the notion that they will have a global experience. They'll have the best teachers that the world can provide, students from all over the world, so the cadre that you are part of is really important. But they're going to situate their real learning experience in very different environments and connect the learning that they have from the faculty with the environment that they are in and make something entirely different out of their experience. Started out with venture capital. It is for profit, and they intend to actually offer a relatively low-cost education. They are accredited, and so ask the question, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, how many of the people in this room might opt for a different kind of education? Or how many students around the world from places that can't come here will have a very high-quality education because you've mixed and matched components in a different way? One alternative model. I want to shift to a very different type of student. And we didn't get the terminology right on this when I was with Jim Honen's class earlier today, but think about working learners. We called these, or the students called these, the plate spinners. You've got a plate on a stick and you're spinning, your life is going around, you've got kids, you've got work, you've got a million things that you've got to do. And that is a huge market of people who maybe haven't been in education, who want to come back to education, they want to switch careers, they want to get the next better job. And that's a huge, huge market. It's about 3 times as large as a traditional post-secondary market, and those people need education for both their life and for their work. And you're seeing new models emerge. This is one that got started in 2013. It's called College for America. It's interesting that it's a branch of a residential private campus, Southern New Hampshire University. But it's designed entirely differently to serve an entirely different audience. It's designed to serve the people who are entry-level, factory floor, doing data entry for insurance companies. And what they do is a model where they contract. They don't go out and recruit students. They recruit employers. And the employers buy a certain number of seats, if you will, for their employees. And the employees learn in a competency-based model. They are situated in the workplace. They do not have to go to campus. And since they are spinning so many plates simultaneously, rather than having a traditional advisor, they have coaches. They have a learning coach. Many times they have a coach that is someone in their workplace, someone in their family, because that's the environment they live in. They don't live in a campus environment. So they shift the support structure. The pricing is totally different, $2,500, and it's an all-you-can-eat model. So you pay $2,500 for a certain period of time, and if you're really aggressive, you can go through lots of different competencies. If you are not quite as aggressive, maybe it takes you longer. The first graduate of this program is a guy who was older. He was a factory worker in a Slim Jim plant, and he received his associate's degree by working really, really hard in 3 months. That's an affordable education to someone we might not have ever been able to reach with some other programs. And there's an increasing list of employers that they are working with. So do the calculation. If you are an employer and think about keeping people in the workplace, for $2,500, I can give someone an education and maybe make my workplace sticky and benefit them, as opposed to having that worker leave, as happens in call centers, factories, manufacturing centers all over the world. I can make it a place they want to stay and grow and move into management. So I can create a workplace that's full of opportunity rather than a workplace that is a revolving door. It's not a model for everyone, but it's increasingly a model for many people. Now, no conversation would be complete without MOOCs, right? So I'm going to give you a little MOOC story here. And what I want to say is that the first instantiation of MOOCs maybe wasn't quite what we thought it was, but there's an interesting marriage now between massive and intensive that is resulting in, I think, a different kind of model. And here's an example. It's a Master of Science program offered by Georgia Tech in computer science. And it's offered for pretty low price. They made a lot of headlines when they announced the program because nobody could imagine that Georgia Tech could offer a program, a master's degree in computer science at that price. But they use MOOCs, and they have MOOC material that they've developed with Udacity. But a lot of the program is really designed around problem sets, social networking, students working together on really hard problems. And they've got a very impressive group of students that are doing very impressive work in artificial intelligence and all kinds of other fields. It's priced at $7,000. There are currently 2,300 students that are part of the program. Their design point is not to restrict admission. Their design point, like Minerva actually, that we talked about a few minutes ago, is to admit as many students as are qualified. You have to be qualified, so quality is not going through the floor, but they don't have a physical cap in the same way that you might in other kinds of programs. So 2,300 students are enrolled in that program. They hope to increase that number. The faculty to student ratio, because they do some of the teaching with MOOCs, is 200 to 1. They have a lot of TAs because that's where the real action is in problem solving and mentored learning. The interesting point, though, the big benefit may not be just in the online program, but what it's doing to the residential program, because it is growing substantially. So there's a brand enhancement and awareness and an attraction for people to go to the regular program, not just the online. So they are proving to themselves that they're not cannibalizing their traditional population by moving to a different form. And another example that is really interesting in the marketplace is that you're seeing the partnership between employers and educators in creating entire alternatives to degrees. And the example that I would share with you is something that a lot of people are calling microcredentialing now. So rather than trying to do a 2-year program, a 4-year program, whatever length kind of program, you're modularizing and snipping things up into smaller segments. And that's not, again, necessarily new. But what's really interesting in the environment right now is literally every day, there was one announced this morning, where a MOOC provider is partnering with industry, coming up with credentials and offering programs that allow people to accumulate these micro-credentials. And it's creating, if you will, an alternative marketplace completely around the outside of traditional higher education. It's not trying to replace it. It's providing people with a set of credentials that they simply wouldn't have had before. Coursera has its own program called Specializations. They take a group of related courses that are already out there. It's not just about learning online. It's not just about being with dead video. There are some pretty serious capstone projects that are embedded with employers that you have to go through to actually graduate and receive the specialization. Udacity, has a nano degree that they came out with. edX had one that was announced earlier today. So the point is, when you think about the expanding universe, the changing ecosystem of higher education, it's not either or. There are a lot of different niches where different kinds of programs are emerging. And I think one of the challenges is actually for organizations like you all represent, people in the audience, to think about those new models, the niches that we might grow into, because today may be good, but tomorrow can be even better. And I think that's part of our challenge, is how do you see where we are, how do you perceive where we need to go, and how do you create a path to get there? The final segment that I want to share with you is that it doesn't stop with degrees. So learning really does connect all aspects of life, right? You never do anything in life that you're not learning. And again, massive providers are moving into this market. So this is one that involves AARP, and I'm retiring. Chris maybe didn't tell you that, but I'm interested in this one. And what it is it's designed as a learning portal for people of all ages. And you can go in and do an exercise It's also, it's called Open College with Kaplan University, where I can go in and say, you know, I'm interested in exploring these different things that I might do in retirement. I'm interested in thinking about another career. I want to find out what I'm good at. And it will give me some screening tools, but then what it is really a front end to a lifetime of learning in any way, size, shape, or form that I want to have it. So I can go in and look at my preferences. It can direct me to MOOCs. It can help me find ways of stringing together credentials that I might have and looking at how I can move into new careers, how I can certify that and prove that to employers. So don't think that your life is over when you're done working or when you're done being educated. Because life really is lifelong, and you might be able to do some things that are really different. So I am going to hit pause there and invite Chris to respond to some of the ideas that I've thrown out there for you. Chris?
Please join me in thanking Diana. So, we're going to sit up here. I'm going to talk for just a little while because both Diana and I believe that teaching and learning is interactive. So we want to get as quickly as possible to your comments, your questions, your interactions with us. I enjoy working with Diana so much in part because she has powerful ideas, but she frames those with illustrations. So with every set of ideas, she gave you an example that you can drill down into later, kick the tires, see how you feel about it. But she also has very perceptive ways of framing the larger issue. And those of you who know me know that I love to play with design. And so this idea that we've got the opportunity to do mix and match models that are each a different way of reinventing higher education or post-secondary learning, that are each a different part of the ecosystem, not either or but both and, is very intriguing. And it reminds me of tangrams. I don't know how many of you remember tangrams where you have 7 different pieces and you can put them together in different ways. So you can make an elephant, or you can make a bird, or you can make a person, or you can make a building. And there are all these interesting challenges. Can you make X? And then you put the pieces together a certain way and try to make something. So I thought as my discussion, because there's so much that Diana said that it's silly for me to try to discuss it piece by piece. For my discussion, I would try to apply some of this to Harvard, at least as I understand Harvard, as a kind of a tangram exercise. What kind of mix and match model could I put together that might solve a problem at Harvard? And there is a big problem at Harvard that you don't read about in the Boston Globe, but is something that we talk about internally. It's called the Harvard paradox. And the paradox is that we want the brand to be scarce, but we want the big ideas to change the world. Those two do not go together well. If Harvard had a powerful way of delivering a Harvard education to 1 million people, it wouldn't do it. That would dilute the brand in Harvard's terms. But it does want to have not 1 million people, but 1 billion people or several billion people thinking about Harvard's ideas. And I think MOOCs and some of the hype that began around MOOCs, some of which unfortunately persists to this day, was about thinking, oh, this is going to solve the Harvard paradox. Actually, though, I want to think about a different way of solving it that predates the MOOCs, and that's to think about the Harvard Business School and the idea of business cases. The Harvard Business School, as you may know, develops and then markets business cases. Those cases are taught a wide variety of other places by faculty who aren't Harvard faculty to students who aren't Harvard students who get degrees that aren't Harvard degrees, but their experience is very strongly shaped by the case. The case provides a structure, the case provides a pedagogy, the case provides the content, And in fact, Harvard is also happy to sell those institutions professional development for their faculty so they know how to teach the case. And of course, one of the reasons that the Harvard Business School has a very lavish campus on the other side of the river is they have an enormous income generating mechanism from this business of selling cases. But this is a different kind of massive. You're not diluting the Harvard degree, but you're having an enormous influence on the lives of students everywhere because you've got this distribution system in terms of cases. So now I'm going to play tangrams with some of the themes that Diana was talking about. Let's take the Harvard Graduate School of Education. What if we developed things that were richer than cases? What would those things be like? Well, I'm not certain right now, but they would have different kinds of interfaces, as Diana was modeling. They might be games and simulations that was a big part of the experience, as Diana was describing. They would use analytics so that you were watching how people navigated through the game or the simulation or the experience or the case, and you were changing the experience based on where people were getting stuck or where people were learning a lot. One of my colleagues asked a very interesting question yesterday at a different talk, not by Diana, but about online learning. He said, when do you want expertise and when do you want crowdsourcing? And I spent a lot of last night thinking about that because I think it's a deep and interesting question. And I don't have the answer, but I have an answer, which is where there's something that has a history behind it, where this is some kind of perennial problem that people have done a lot of thinking about, you want expertise because you want people to understand that there are answers to parts of this that have already been developed that don't need to be reinvented. But where a problem is unique in history, it's occurring now for the first time, and you want a lot of crowdsourcing because you want a lot of multiple perspectives as you walk around the elephant in order to just understand what this new kind of animal is. So these learning experiences, I think, would be challenging to create because what you want is the Harvard expertise that's infused into the game or simulation. But as Diana was saying, I think, in some of her examples, the people in that class somewhere else with a different faculty member in a different place than Cambridge want to be able to look at their local environment and say, oh, that's like my school, or that's like my university, or that's like my students, or that's like my teaching. And so there's a kind of resonance and tension between the crowdsourcing and the local and the abstract and the generic part of expertise. So the point that I want to make here is simply this. That's a different kind of massive. That's a kind of massive that might be good or bad. We can, form our different conclusions about it. But it does address this issue of the Harvard paradox. So beyond whatever we do tonight with your making points or asking questions or bringing up issues that connect to the different things that Diana identified, the different ideas, I would encourage you after you leave to spend some time doing intellectual tangrams with these pieces of post-secondary learning, or maybe some of them would trickle down into K-12 learning, and technology, because I think the biggest single impact on higher education and life-wide learning in the next decade is going to be not the ways that we improve our standard models, as important as those ways are and as valuable as they are to pursue, but the ways that we broaden and deepen the ecosystem by coming up with these new models that serve different kinds of audiences, especially from a social justice perspective, audiences that are now underserved and that we struggle to accommodate with our traditional models. So with that, I'm going to throw it open. There are 2 microphones. Please come up to the microphone, tell us who you are, ask a question. You have to go to the microphone, Fernando. Ask a question that does have a question mark at the end of it.
Thank you, Diana. My name is Fernando Reimers, and I'm a member of this faculty. Thank you for a great talk. How do you foresee, so you have outlined disruption, the creation of a very different way of learning and teaching that is happening largely in the periphery of the existing institutions of higher education. What are your thoughts about how one might transition from the system that we know today to a point where the system is a lot more personalized, a lot more opportunity for the user to shape what they want to learn? Do you think that this is going to happen as Clayton Christensen describes disruption in the mini computer industry, that one day we're going to wake up and discover that we are the dinosaurs of a bygone era and there are all these things? Or do you think that the incumbent institutions will be able to reinvent themselves to stay relevant? What are your thoughts on that?
No one has a crystal ball, but I will tell you what I think may be a likely path, and that is that many institutions will continue very much as they are. They will continue to improve. Higher education doesn't stand still, but they serve a market, they serve it very well. I do think you will see a number of institutions really struggle as we go into the future because the financial model is becoming so very, very constrained. We saw a college go out of business last week, right? So it's not totally unheard of. But where I think there will be a lot of evolution is that institutions will see sort of an ancillary business emerging. So I'll give you an example with competency-based education. That's not what students at the University of Wisconsin-Madison are really signing up for, right? They're going to a research-intensive university. Yet the University of Wisconsin has an extension division. It used to be the old non-residential instruction, distance education. They've been very quietly moving into competency-based education because it allows them to serve a different group of people. It started sort of from the outside. They're now looking at competency-based education programs in a number of their institutions. Maybe it will reach Madison. But they're all part of a system, right? So you've got some bookends, maybe, of the types of traditional organizations that will continue to have real competitive advantage. But then there are some other things that are going to gradually ease in, and they're going to begin serving markets that are not being served today. And so on the front of competency-based education, using that as one data point, we know of 240 institutions that are very actively looking to move into competency-based education. That would be quite a shift, quite an expansion of the market as that begins to be manifest. So I don't think you're going to see a lot of traditional higher education go away, but the point is there's a lot of us that would need more education, that may need to have a different type of education, and that's where I think the market is going to be really different. And I would use a phrase, sorry, one footnote that came up when I was listening to the students do cases this morning. And maybe it's less about disruption and more about intentional design.
From here.
Hi, I'm Michael Getz. I'm a higher ed master student. Thank you so much. This is great, and thanks for coming to class this morning, too. I have a question. What do you make of the fact that so many of the players in this space, certainly not all, are for-profit? And part of the reason I ask is because in our nonprofit colleges and universities in the U.S., the owners, the trustees, are people who are very involved in the college. They're the governors of the college, but we don't pay them. They don't get a kickback from the endowment. In fact, we often ask them for gifts. And I know that not all of these ed tech things are institutions in themselves, but they're working with institutions, and then some, like Minerva, are endeavoring to be institutions. So what does it mean when they're for-profit and the board, the owners, maybe have a different motivation, if it means anything?
I'll start, and then Chris probably has an opinion on this too. I think it's easier to do startups in for-profit organizations because you can simply wall off a certain part of the organization, make an investment, and go for it. and try to incubate it and decide whether you've got a viable product or not. That's much harder to do in our traditional shared governance. When you say not for profit, I'm assuming you largely mean colleges and universities. It is very hard to do that kind of thing. Southern New Hampshire is an interesting case in point. They have different types of programs. As I mentioned before, they've got a residential program. They also created College for America. It's not in the same city. It's a different set of people, a different set of incentives, a whole different set of, if you will, faculty rules, a different kind of governance structure. They, by the way, have set up a for-profit subsidiary that is funded entirely by the university for the software they created to run the program. So there may be some interesting nuances.
And again, there aren't any crystal balls, but I would note that if you look at the trends that are happening to the not-for-profits, states are steadily cutting funding. Governors are saying, can't you do this in 3 years instead of 4? We see the erosion of faculty salaries. So it's clear that not-for-profits have a difficult model to evolve, and yet they're in a competitive environment where they're really coming under a lot of pressures for the traditional model. And if you turn to the public and say, why don't you throw out the rascals that want to cut higher education and instead put in some enlightened legislators that will put funding back into this vital investment, by and large, the public says, hell no. We think this stuff takes too long. We don't think it relates to the real world. Rightly or wrongly, we don't have the public base anymore for the nonprofits that we used to in general. And so there are some real puzzles as to how to resolve this sort of tension between for-profit motives but flexibility and nonprofit purity but perhaps increasing dysfunctionality relative to the context. Isa?
Thank you, Chris. Isa Zimmerman, a graduate of this wonderful place, I have to say. This morning I heard the Commissioner of Early Childhood and the Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education speak about some of the issues that are being identified right now that need to be addressed. And it was clear that one of the mechanisms that we need to rethink is professional development, professional learning, whatever we want to call it, in-service education. I don't think we've got a good title for it yet. My question is, some of what the ideas that you both expressed, I think are ideas that should come into that arena. Is anybody thinking about that arena as needing to be completely revamped and revised and renewed and reviewed? And if so, can you tell me? Because I think all of us would make a great contribution. I mean, as a former administrator, I heard both compliments about particular approaches and terrible reviews about things that people didn't like. And if you don't like something, you're not going to learn. So my question is anybody working in this space? And if so, can we all get connected to do something good?
You're working in this space.
So one of my doctoral students and I are part of a National Science Foundation grant to study AP high school science teachers, biology, physics, chemistry, AP. And the challenge in these advanced placement courses is that the tests have changed dramatically because of the next generation science standards, because of the Common Core, because colleges were complaining that students passed these courses, but they had a broad, shallow understanding, no basis in inquiry, no concept of the big ideas. So the new tests center on inquiry, they center on the big ideas. Teachers of these AP courses, by and large, said to themselves, oh, we do that stuff. Well, just do a little more of it. First round of test results came out, a lot of weeping and wailing. A lot of teachers whose students were getting 5s suddenly students are getting 3s or even 2s. So they're faced with a forced transformation issue where there's a very high stakes public measure of what they're doing and not doing. What does this have to do with professional development? Well, there's 2 kinds of professional development these teachers are getting. One of them, as you would expect, is top-down professional development from places like universities, from the College Board itself. Here's how to rethink these big ideas. Here's some content knowledge you may need. Here's some changes in pedagogy you might want to think about, and so on. The other, and this is what we're studying, is the bottom-up, peer-driven professional learning communities, where now it's the teachers talking to each other. Gee, your students did really well on this test. My students are struggling. Your students are pretty much the same as mine demographically. What's your secret sauce? And those conversations are very interesting. And I suspect that a lot of the teachers are getting more from that than they are from the top-down professional development, because when we look not at causation, but at correlations between high test scores and professional development pattern, the strongest single correlation is membership and participation in these bottom-up professional development things. So what does this say? Well, I don't think it says let's get rid of formal professional development and do professional learning communities. I don't think it says that at all. I think it says that what we need is some kind of a hybrid between the two, and a hybrid in which the two are interwoven rather than having some kind of firewall between them. That somehow professional development needs to combine the wisdom of practice and the kind of more formal types of academic knowledge and research-based approaches to teaching that come out of places like universities. I don't know exactly what that hybrid should look like, but I think that that's a promising direction to think in. Over here, sorry.
Thank you.
Trying to alternate.
Bob Phillips, I'm with the HBX project. One of the interesting common themes, Diana, through your talk, and actually in what you were just talking about, Chris, is this notion of a learning community and peer-based learning. I know one of the things we're seeing in HBX is as we deliver this case-based methodology to a wider array of people, that the peer help element and the community element, which we're still learning about, has been an important part of learning. And yet, I don't know that I've seen a lot of work in that kind of horizontal of how that peer-based or learning community can be most effectively leveraged. We know it gives us a lot of data. We know that that data is useful in improving courses, but and it is a common theme through almost every component of what you talked about. I just was curious about your thoughts and what you're seeing in terms of really looking at that piece, because obviously technology can play a huge role in facilitating that kind of community in a peer-based learning scenario.
You actually had someone here yesterday afternoon talking about peer-based learning from UC San Diego. And I do think that there's a lot that we don't have a clue about when it comes to peer-based learning. We've got this vague notion that more people is better. We also know that with the right kind of structure, peers working with each other can get better. They can learn the behavior. I don't have a good answer for you at this point. I think we're still groping for how you really channel that. There's a lot of power in multiple thoughts, people voting ideas, voting them down, doing distributed problem solving. There are a lot of people developing emerging platforms, but the honest answer for you is I don't know that we really understand that all that well yet.
If I give an intuitive answer just based on my own work in teaching and informing peer groups, I know that you want a group that is both similar and complementary. So you want people with similar interests and passions so that they're pulling towards the same goals. But you want people with different knowledge bases and different experiences so that they aren't sharing ignorance, but they're actually pooling pieces of the puzzle together. Now, I face two problems when I try to develop those kinds of peer learning groups in my own classes. First, I don't know enough about the students. And so we need models that give us the important dimensions on which to construct these complementary things, and we need inventories that people could take at the start of a course that would be pretty simple, wouldn't take more than 15 minutes or so, and then you use a matching system to create that. But the second problem that I face, even if I had those inventories, if I've got a group of 50, I'm pretty limited in the dimensions. I may not be able to put very ideal groups together just because I'm arranging 50 in groups of 5. What if I have 100,000? Now I could really create the world's most wonderful peer learning groups. And so I think that's one of the interesting promises of Massive, is that if we just had the right models and the right inventories, again, we could do this through iteration. We could do what we think is right. We could watch which groups succeeded and failed, collect the analytic data, modify the model, and keep going. So I think that there is a path forward to try to get to where we need to be, and it may be the single most important path to making Massive work well is the peer learning path.
I would just add a footnote that if you look at what you see happening in distributed problem solving, for example, these big crowdsourcing projects, knowing profiles may be one thing, but not matching like with like is also probably very important. And the research that was shared yesterday afternoon, for example, the greater diversity, like geographically, globally, that you had, the more interaction there was. And in the distributed problem-solving world, of course, it's the people who are from outside the traditional area you think you're going to find the expertise that are actually the better problem solvers because they're applying a different heuristic. So I think lots yet to know. But if you don't have scale, you maybe never have the chance to find those things out.
Hi, Jed Schwartz, writer. I'm wondering, I have a few questions. One is, are you talking about a prospective sort of relationship between Harvard Graduate School of Education and these for-profit interactive program manufacturing companies that I take it you're talking about? Because, for example, when I was in 7th grade, I was in a junior high school near New Haven, and they gave us a book in math called the School Mathematics Study Group, which was very advanced and really helped me out a great deal. And it was, I don't think it got distributed very far geographically, but I think then I moved and a long way, and they gave us long division, and it was terrible, it was, and it seems to me that education is often for the purposes of inculcating modes of psychological domination, control that were designed for the assembly line industrial culture, and that there's now a need to devise modes of education that are more effective and that are not designed to get the student to knuckle under to the authority of the teachers, but to actually engage their minds. And if you could bottle the Harvard graduate educational program, I don't know how good it is, but it would be as good as it could be. And then if you get it out to the country and to the into other areas, it might be a very positive thing. But I wasn't clear on whether you the speaker, Diane, are in this is a for-profit educational endeavor, that is a corporate endeavor that like University of Phoenix, are you something like that?
I do not represent a for-profit organization. I represent a nonprofit organization that works with colleges and universities worldwide. We try to understand what's happening in education and share ideas with people, because I do believe that change is a choice, and the best choice is an informed choice. So sharing with you different examples and illustrations will allow people to make better choices. I will not prejudge what Harvard should do. I think that's a very, very complicated decision that involves a lot of values and many, many other kinds of dimensions. We do see that some of these educational innovations are being developed in the for-profit sector. You're seeing a ton that are being developed by colleges and universities and not-for-profits. And a lot of the market is actually moving very strongly to open education resources, open education access, where the real value is in sharing your idea and your innovation with people, not trying to lock it up, because that's where the real value is. So Chris, you may have more that you want to add there.
Well, the only thing I want to add is that deciding what Harvard is going to do is well above my pay grade. I am not announcing anything here. I'm playing with ideas. I think that Harvard will eventually make some decisions. I don't know what those decisions are going to be. But regardless of what Harvard does, I think the larger question of a lot of actors in this ecosystem, thousands of actors in this ecosystem, making their individual decisions, how can we organize that, whether it's bottom up, middle out, or top down, so that we end up with a really good ecosystem that serves the full range of demand? I think that's the interesting question. Right, I'm going to ask you to not ask more questions at this point so everybody gets a chance. Julie?
Hi, I'm Julie Rubin. I'm on the faculty here, and thank you very much for your talk. I have a question that is a little bit of a follow-up on Fernando's and also kind of builds on this issue of ecosystem and the idea that the ecosystem fulfills a lot of different purposes, and our current ecosystem doesn't fulfill certain purposes well, and it fulfills other purposes well. But so in response to Fernando's question about disruption, you sort of answered, well, a lot of institutions will continue as they are, and some institutions will serve new markets and create new things. But some of the examples that you showed us, they clearly, if they were successful, they would disrupt our current system. So Minerva, if it was really successful and could break the problem of scale, would pull out students out of existing liberal arts colleges. Georgia Tech, if it was successful with its master's program, could break the problem of scale. It would pull out master's students from other engineering master's programs, and it would end up disrupting, and that might be very good for the students. It might be very good for learning. It might give them higher quality learning at a lower price, and that would be good. But what I'm wondering is about, in thinking about the whole system, what would happen to a certain function that's supported now, and that's the function of research, creating new content, and also preparing instructors who are teaching at the edge of expertise or near the edge of expertise. So, like you said, in the Georgia Tech master's program, TAs are very important. Clearly, the content is largely drawn from the existing PhD engineering programs already at Georgia Tech. And so in a way, that master's program will poach from the existing knowledge-producing and instructor-producing institutions in order to provide at a greater scale. But what will happen to those functions of the institutions, the research-producing and the instructor-producing functions, if the system got disrupted? What could you imagine in a new ecosystem supporting those functions that are now supported in our current ecosystem somewhat at the expense of certain kinds of learning?
It's an interesting question. So what I suspect is true is that actually the research enterprise is under a tremendous amount of threat right now without any of this other disruption, because a lot of the research engine, not all of it certainly, has been in public research universities. They are very underfunded. They are getting more and more squeezed, and actually National Academy has a book out about the demise of the public research university because the financial projections are that it's going to be very difficult to sustain that. That is a big worry. Not that private research universities have anything against them, but where do you put all of that capacity if you begin to squeeze that out? I don't know what the answer to that is, because as Chris said before, there's kind of a public sentiment about what you fund and very much a return on investment kind of swing of the pendulum that we seem to be in right now that makes that a difficult enterprise to fund. Same thing is happening in corporations, isn't it? Where a lot of corporations that used to do some massive research are no longer really able to support that. Is it going overseas and happening in other countries? Perhaps. I don't know enough about the segment, but you raise a legitimate point. I don't have a good crystal ball for that. For the instruction and where are the future teachers going to come and how do they get back into the enterprise, I would maybe offer you an option that's a little bit on the disruptive side. So what if rather than future instructors always coming from graduate students like I was and enjoyed and liked being a TA, what if there's a new cadre that is much more like what you've seen in other segments where you have professors of the practice, you have active practitioners who want to give back and are able to learn different kinds of skills, fit in, provide a different kind of support. Now maybe it's not an entire semester, maybe it's not 4 years at a time, but if you think about that being punctuated with people who can help from different places of the community, does that make education richer? It's kind of a mess to manage in the short term, maybe, but there may be some options that we simply don't think about right now.
And I'd just make a couple points in connection with that. The first is, I mentioned in the introduction to Diana that I had gotten this NSF grant and we had done a workshop on massive learning. One of the reasons NSF funded the workshop, one of the things they were most interested in was a fear that massive learning was going to disrupt the research engine in this country, which of course the National Science Foundation is deeply concerned with. And they were hoping we would wrestle with this question of, was that a risk, and where were researchers going to come from, where were they going to work, where was their funding going to come from? So this is a big concern on the part of many people. The second thing that I would offer is an analogy, which is that in some ways, not in every way, but in some ways, the move in healthcare from illness to wellness has been a kind of divergence into a larger ecosystem with many different levels of providers and consumers. And it has made health research more complicated, but it hasn't killed off health research. In fact, it's generated very rich new sources of data for health research and very rich new questions about illness and wellness that can be answered within this new ecosystem. And one wonders if something similar would happen in education, that yes, there would be a difficult intermediate period, but there would be many new kinds of questions that could be asked and answered about teaching and learning in a more distributed ecosystem. And the only other quick point I would make, I'm running some workshops now for NSF on big data. And one of the interesting talks that was given by someone from the astronomy community. And she pointed out that now the majority of astronomical data is not collected or analyzed in terms of patterns by astronomers or astronomic researchers. It's done by citizens. And the reason is that there's so much more data now that the researchers cannot handle it. And they're using citizens sometimes in relatively low-level classification tasks, but if the citizens are interested more in high-level classification tasks, and even in starting to co-author some of these papers. And so I think we have to ask if all of these disruptions take place, but there's a much greater proportion of the population that's educated, perhaps not to a postdoctoral level, but at least to some level of post-secondary, how many new kinds of human capacity does that open up to advance research? So, brave new world, for better or for worse. Art?
My name is Art Bardage. I'm a digital learning provider, math educator. I'd like to follow this up a little bit, Diana, and ask about other concerns that you may have. As you were speaking, I had a couple of things that sort of poked at my heartstrings. One of them is with this big data and this capability that technology provides, we're starting to get into the place where we're manipulating students, where they're losing their freedom of choice, and we're actually being able to cleverly manipulate their activities. I'm just wondering if that's a concern. The other concern that I have, sort of in the same vein, is the differentiation between learning and training. It used to be pretty clear that we understood who was doing a training sort of thing and who was doing a learning sort of thing. And as you were describing some of these activities, particularly some of these online courses, they sort of began to seem like training to me. And we started blurring that line. I'm just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
I'd be happy to, and certainly there are all kinds of concerns that we can all have, and I think it's up to us as a community to air those and try to be alert and guard against them. So on your point, are we manipulating students? Are they losing degrees of freedom? Probably not. In my estimation, quite honestly. When we've talked to students about the use of analytics, for example, their response many times is, oh my gosh, I never knew. Thank you for telling me. You told me something I didn't know before it was too late. So any tool can be used for ill. Anything in excess, even drinking too much water can harm you. So you have to trust to a certain extent in the checks and balances in the systems. And I don't think you've got unethical people doing much of what's happening in education. There are always bad actors in any kind of segment. But my point comes back to the students feel that we're providing them a service. It's not taking people out of the equation. Many times it's giving them insight and visibility into a process that was hidden before, whether it's in selecting courses, whether it's knowing whether they're at risk of failing, whether it's moving faster on time to degree. Making you aware of where you are and what the choices are is, I think, quite different than removing control from people. So most of what I see is actually very much on the good side. And by having that visibility and using the technology tools to do things that you can only do at scale or are better done that way, you actually free people up to do the more human side of things. And that's really where I see a lot of the activity happening. So I would choose to see it, if you will, on a more positive side. On the issue of training as opposed to education, I may not have presented the examples well. If that is the way that it came across. Because actually what I think is happening with a lot of these examples is that rather than people knowing what, they're learning to do, which is a much more nuanced thing. You don't just know content, but now you know the pattern of how you think about things in a discipline. You know how to apply different kinds of problem solving. You know how to go find different types of information, network with people to provide pieces that you don't before. So I am sorry if it sounded like it's training. Actually, much of it is the opposite. You absolutely can do training online, but remember, with many of these tools like simulations, you're integrating that into a larger framework and actually giving people options that they might not have had before in the way that they currently have. And if you look at the kinds of skills that people need in today's environment, it's much more nuanced around problem solving, dealing with ill-formed questions, and I think it's exactly these kinds of environments that allow you to muck around in that allow you to develop those skills rather than falling back into training.
And I'll just make 2 quick points. I think that ultimately the single most important thing that keeps people from being manipulated is where the decisions are made. If the decisions are made by the teacher and the student is sort of the puppet, that's scary. If the student is informed, here's what the analytics are saying, now you take your choices, different situations. So I think that that's a guideline that we need to be very serious about. Stealth analytics is tricky. The other thing I'd say is that Diana and I had an interesting conversation yesterday afternoon from people from one branch of the military services, I'm being deliberately vague, who were talking to us about the fact that their training works really well, but that really in the modern world, beyond the training, people serving in this branch need to understand how to take risks. They need to understand what to do in ambiguous situations, and they need to understand how to take on leadership responsibilities when that isn't part of their job description. And those are things that we would certainly think of as falling more under education. And they understand how to do training, but not really how to do that. So I think there's an interesting continuum here where you've got sort of pure learning at one end and pure training at the other end, and a whole lot of interesting stuff in the middle. And how do we, help move people in this direction? So we've got time just for one more question.
Yeah, thank you for letting me ask the last question. My name's Chris. I'm a former student of Professor Rubin's, and it was actually dawned on me while she was talking is that not only is higher education continually moving, but even back to the earliest days of the history of higher education, there's always been international influences in American education, right? Just borrowing from English and German universities. But as we're talking in an environment where technology should be flattening a hierarchy of ideas, a lot of the examples we hear, whether it be edX or HBX or Udacity, are often American firms or feel that way. A lot of ideas generated from Stanford and these types of things. So I was wondering if you could just share some of your examples or some of the interesting things as far as how technology is being used in these areas from international examples.
I think there is a very rich set of examples of technology use in developing countries and countries where they've got wide expansive distance to reach people that can't come to one place. So a whole different notion of distributed learning environment, reaching people. I could go on and on. Lots of open universities. Australia has done some very interesting things with education because of the distance that they have. New Zealand is working with tools that are like nudges to help students who are in their indigenous populations feel more confident about their learning skills and try to bring them in to different kinds of educational environments. So a lot of the firms may be US based, but certainly not all the innovation is in the US. And I think you look to different places based on different problems that they've got that they're trying to address. And one of the big ones is around open education and the global need.
And I'd just reinforce what Diana is saying, that in the US maybe the key word is MOOCs, but in the developing world the key word is more the open universities. I was in Shanghai in May. Last May I keynoted a conference for Shanghai Open University that was for open universities across the developing world, and then I met with people at Shanghai University. And they posed a very interesting problem to me. They said, Chris, you know a lot about scale. We have a scale problem. We have 110,000 degree students. We have 500,000 life-wide learners, and we're too small. China has 1 billion people in it. how do we get 30 times larger? Well, of course, you know, I'm already thinking, gee, they've got scale, and now, whoops, here's another level. So I think there are some really interesting puzzles that the open universities are approaching, I think, very effectively in a different way than the MOOCs are, and that's a nice creative tension to be able to talk about. So it is the witching hour, but I want to just provide two sets of thanks. One set of thanks is actually to the dean, because the dean this year has enabled us to fund some technology fellows. And that means that rather than just flying in and doing the Lone Ranger gig that we're all so familiar with and flying out again, Diana has been able to come and be here on campus so far for 3 days, although it may seem like 3 years to you at this point. But actually through next Tuesday, we're working her very hard, but she's being very gracious about that. She's teaching classes, she's meeting with different groups. We hope that she's getting a lot out of this. We know that we're getting a lot out of this, but it's very special to be able to do this beyond just a single one-night stand. And I think that the fact that Diana is referencing the kinds of things that she's already picked up on in different courses makes this kind of interchange all the richer and more interesting. But the other thing that I would say is it really takes an extraordinary person who's as busy as Diana to say, sure, I'll come spend 10 days with you. I'll come and do all this stuff with you. So thank you to the dean and thank you to Diana.